Hello, Advanced Algebra 2 students. My name is Ms. Versailles, and I'm going to teach you how to evaluate inverse functions. So let's just recall that an inverse function is when we reverse the x values and the y values. The inputs and the outputs are reversed from the original function. So if I want to evaluate inverse functions, let's recall function notation. F of x equals y. X is our input, y is our output. When we evaluate inverse functions, our notation for an inverse function is f to the negative 1 of x. So this value inside here is going to be our output of our original function. We have 3 examples to evaluate inverses. Here's example 1. We have a rational function graphed, and I want you to find f of 0, f of 2, and f of negative 4. So this is just a review of function notation. F of 0 means find 0 as an input value on the graph, or an x value. An x value of 0 slides up to an output of 6. So f of 0 equals 6. F of 2, again, 2 is my input, or my x value. Slide to the function, I get 4 as my output, 4. So f of 2 equals 4. F of negative 4, again, that's my input for f's function. So negative 4, slide up, I get 2 as my output. Now let's learn how to evaluate the inverse. So if I want to evaluate f to the negative 1, or the inverse of f of 0, but I have f of x's function. I don't have the inverse of f graphed. I have just f graphed. Because I have f of x graphed, this value 0 is actually an output on f's graph. It's an output. So I'm going to 0 as an output for a y value. My answer is negative 2. The inverse of f of 0 is negative 2. The inverse of f of 3 means 3 is an output on my original functions graph. An output of 3. Output of 3. 1, 2, 3. Oh, there's a horizontal asymptote there, so undefined. Let's try one more. The inverse of f of 2. That's an output on my original functions graph. An output of 2. Slides to negative 4. The inverse of f of 2 equals negative 4. Example 2. We have a function g of x with this mapping diagram. I know it's a function because every input has one output. I know it's a one-to-one function because every output has one input. So here's a few examples that I'll have us evaluate. G of 0, g of 5. The inverse of g of 5, the inverse of g of 0. So I'm going to start with g of 0. This is g's function. So 0 is my input, or my x value, corresponds to negative 1 as the output. So g of 0 is negative 1. Similarly, g of 5, 5 is my input, corresponds to 2 as an output. So g of 5 equals 2. The inverse of g of 5, if I have the original g function here, 5 is an output of the original g's function. 5 is an output of that original. So an output of 5, that corresponds to -1. The inverse of g of 5 is -1. Similarly, the inverse of g of 0, an output of 0, corresponds to -2. This would be a similar scenario if I represented the functions as ordered pairs or a table. My last example is, what if I represent the function as an equation? Here's one example, h of 0. And then the other example I'll give you is the inverse of h of -4. So if I want to evaluate h of 0, that means I'm going to input 0 into the equation for x. I'm going to take the cubed root of 3 times 0 minus 1. So h of 0 equals the cubed root of 0 minus 1, -1. And we know the cubed root of -1 is -1. Because -1 times -1 times -1 equals -1. Now if I ask you to evaluate the inverse of h of -4, I could write the inverse equation, but we don't know how to do that yet. So instead, I'm going to use the same concept that we used up here. I have h's equation. I don't have the inverse of h's equation. So because I have h's equation, -4 is my output for h of x. So I'm going to put -4 as the output for h of x, and I'm going to solve for x to get my answer. -4 is the output for h of x. Oops. -1. Notice I wrote h of x's equation, set it equal to -4, and now I'm going to solve this radical equation by cubing both sides. -4 cubed is -64. Add 1 to both sides, -63. And divide both sides by 3, I get -21. So the inverse of h of -4 is -21. If you have any questions, just rewatch this video, speed it up, slow it down, pause it, ask questions, send emails, and make sure that you can learn and know how to evaluate inverse functions. Have a great day.